And good morning, everybody. Good Monday morning. It's September the 12th of 2022, and glad to have you with me for another Monday morning reading here at McDuff Lives. And thanks for joining me if you're on Facebook, as well as McDuff Lives 2 on YouTube. Got another strike on McDuff Lives 1. It was from a 2020 interview I did with George Webb. And they struck it, but then they said, well, we realize you may not have known that this violated our rules, so we're not going to give you a strike. And I thought, well, isn't that sweet, but it's about controlling the message that they are so afraid that people are going to learn things like real history and real economics and real motivation and real, who's on first, who's on second, who's playing shortstop. We need to know who the players are, and we can't tell the players without a program. So that's why we have a program here at McDuff Lives. We're going to try to sort it all out. And one of the things that we've done is taken a long-term view of American history. We started way back with the Mayflower and the Jamestown. In the book by H. Graham Lowry, which covered the period from 1608 until 1750. And I did over 27, 28 readings of that book. And they are all available on my BitChute at McDuff Uncensored archive. And you can watch them all straight through, 1 through 27, as a kind of a alternate history lesson. And I don't even want to use the word alternate history, because I think the stuff you've been taught in school is the alternate history. It's the narrative, you know. And what we're trying to do, and I think that has been done very successfully by both Graham Lowry and now in this next book that we're reading by Anton Chaikin and called Who We Are, America's Fight for Universal Progress from Franklin to Kennedy. And this is volume 1 of an intended 3-volume effort that is ongoing by Anton Chaikin, kind enough to take an hour out of his work and be with us about 2 weeks ago. A really, really great interview, and I commend that to you as well. It's right. Also, everything's available on McDuff Uncensored on BitChute. Simplest way to find my material for the last 2+ years. Before that, you'll have to look at McDuff Lives 1, where there's still an archive of, I think, about 300 videos there. Pardon me a second. Morning to everyone. Robert, Corky, Hoos, Harry, Miss Hunt, and Swan. Good morning, and to everyone else who's with us, thank you for joining us. And, well, we are moving through the book Who We Are, and the last chapter, chapter 3, America and France, Fateful Strategy Decisions, we learned that it was Thomas Jefferson whose interaction with Lord Shelburne in Paris, leading to the Treaty of Paris, 1783, was a time that Jefferson appears to have been seduced into the British imperial way of looking at things, at least as far as Virginia is concerned and the South. Well, that is the news that we got from Anton Chaikin, and it kind of shook me up a bit, because I thought Thomas Jefferson was a human rights guy that just didn't quite have it together with regard to the American Indians and Black people generally, but that it was just a sign of his times, and it wasn't anything to be counted against him. But the preservation of the plantation system in the South, the agricultural based system that was thriving by the time of the Civil War upon the uh, labor of enslaved people, was the result of what Jefferson did with Lord Shelburne in 1781, 82, 83. And so that's where we're going to pick up the story in our book. Chapter 4 of the book is called The Founding Program of the American Republic. And with regret, I'm going to say I'm not going to read much from it. It goes through Shays' Rebellion, Henry Knox, and the reasons that Alexander Hamilton saw in support of creating a strong central government. And the main reason was money. They needed to have taxes in order to pay their debts. And the threat of popular uprisings, such as Shays' Rebellion, was very, very real. So, in defense of Hamilton, our author cites General Knox and, of course, the writings of Benjamin Franklin, who by then was 81 years old, but very much in favor of a national government. And that's where a person named Albert Gallatin comes in. We heard from him in the first chapter of the book, and now he's going to be back. A representative we find of the Genevan city-state, the city in Switzerland, which became a powerful center of British intelligence activity. And so let's start with that part of this book. I'm sorry, I'm not going to go into the Virginia plan, the New Jersey plan, and how the fight for ratification went on. Just suffice to say, it's a great account here. Um, so let's pick up on page 95. Now we observe the strange, sudden appearance of Albert Gallatin in American public life. One of the upper-class operatives of Geneva, Switzerland, a clique that Lord Shelburne was then employing for the destabilization of France. His first political task was to try to prevent ratification of the U.S. Constitution. Aha! Well, there you go. There now we have a player on our program, and we can watch him when he comes to bat. Albert Gallatin was a name that you probably saw once in a while in American history, but you never knew why he was important. Of course, he didn't want you to know why he was important, and neither did any of the powers behind him. Oh, hello, Harry's got a lot of comments there. Great. Charles is here. And Hessians have helped to build what is right in America, the right to barter with whiskey. I like that. Um, so what I'm looking for here is the deep state. I think the idea that the deep state just suddenly started in, 1913 or 1945 or 1947, or, you can pick a date, 1871. Lots of candidates out there, but let's remember that this has never been, we've never been without a deep state. And this is where Albert Gallatin comes in to play his role. So he's trying to prevent the ratification of the U.S. Constitution, which is the document that is basically drafted in order to create a strong central government that's strong enough to raise taxes. That is not from the people, by the way. That was just an excise tax. And, the idea behind resisting that was to preserve the power of the elites in the states themselves. People like Aaron Burr, who were buying up huge tracts of land and using them as rentiers, forcing people to farm them and pay rent, which is, passive income, the British oligarchical way. All right, back to the book. His family had helped arrange for the contracting out of Hessian soldiers to King George III for the war against America. So see, there's where the Hessians came from. I thought it was all that what was his name, the Prince of Hesse and his banker, but here we're told it's Geneva, Switzerland behind it. He had immigrated to the U.S. during the Revolution, hung out in the northern woods until the war was over, and taken a commission from Virginia's anti-nationalist faction to set up operations on the frontier in Pennsylvania. From that backwoods base in western Pennsylvania, Gallatin ran the opposition to the state's ratification of the plan for America's national government. The Anglophile historian Henry Adams wrote in his admiring Gallatin biography, quote, "Mr. Gallatin never changed his opinion that the president was too powerful. Even in his most mature age, he would probably have preferred a system more nearly resembling some of the present, that is in the 1870s, colonial governments of Great Britain." The Pennsylvania legislature attempted to call a state ratification convention, but it was stalled by the Gallatin clique, which staged a walkout, preventing a quorum. Pro-Constitution laborers and tradesmen went to the houses of two of these anti-federalists, broke in, and dragged them to the state house, delivering them into the assembly room for the vote. At the ensuing convention, Gallatin and his floor captain, John Smiley, battled Franklin's Philadelphians and lost 2-1. This same Gallatin promulgated the British originated, quote, free trade economic doctrines that would be used against the administration of President George Washington. As U.S. Treasury Secretary from 1801 to 1813, in a federal government whose establishment he had opposed, Gallatin would respond to British naval assaults and terrorism by systematically dissolving the U.S. armed forces. And now I'll skip a few pages to arrive at chapter 5 on page 103. This is the meat of what I wanted to get to today. It is called Shelburne and Jefferson in France. Lord Shelburne, as de facto head of British intelligence, commanded a global strategic force in banking, imperial trade, espionage, and political intrigue. Shelburne assembled a team of operatives for action across the English Channel. A number of his Genevan agents had moved into Paris in 1788. It must be kept in mind that Shelburne was in touch with the American ambassador to France, Thomas Jefferson, while this offensive was proceeding, until Jefferson left Paris in August 1789. Jeremy Bentham was the team leader. After his attack on the American Declaration of Independence, denying the existence of natural or God-given rights, Bentham had gone further, saying that individual human beings can act only in response to their own pleasure or pain. He denied any inherent right and wrong, ruling out all motivations based on higher ideas, all religion, all philosophy beyond aesthetics. Bentham's soulless man is the perfect subject for manipulation by and oligarchy. And that idea that humans are motivated only in response to pleasure or pain is the essence of racism. It's the essence of the problem that we face today in trying to treat all of our fellow humans as fully human and fully endowed by their creator with inalienable rights. That was my comment, sorry. While Bentham was in Russia in 1786 to 7, he had written In Defense of Usury, saying that government must not interfere with the right of rich men to do whatever they please with their money, and to charge whatever interest rate they can get away with. Otherwise, Bentham claimed, industrial innovations were impossible. A flagrant lie, since he was very familiar with the works of the Franklin Allied Lunar Society men, whose projects were neither funded nor motivated according to Bentham's logic. While in Russia, Bentham had also begun designing his famous panopticon, a circular prison whose watchman can observe all inmates at once without being seen, and whose inmates, including children, would supply power by exerting themselves on devices attached to machines. Well, take a deep breath and think about whether we're not being drawn into a panopticon as we speak. Now back from Russia, Bentham, this new type of liberal, easily recognizable in today's globalist surveillance state, activated Shelburne's men in England and France who put into motion others not directly tied to Shelburne. In the destabilization described here, so crucial to global history, the cast of characters included both Shelburne's agents and certain wealthy Frenchmen who were his political partners. And then the author lists a long list of them, about most of them French, some of them British, including the famous Jean-Paul Marat, who was born in Neuchâtel to Genevan parents and lived in England, and Jacques Necker, the Geneva-born international banker, who became rich in London speculating on imperial ventures in India and Caribbean slave plantations. British political interventions to blow up France. The British offensive that anarchized and blew up the French Revolution featured a series of political interventions at points of crisis in France. Their pivot was the Count de Mirabeau and British operatives swarming around him. France was simultaneously buffeted by austerity and credit withdrawal, engineered by Jacques Necker and other Anglo-Swiss French bankers, such as Isaac Pinchot and Jean-Frédéric Perregaux. In the spring of 1789, in the Estates General, the conference of the various orders and ranks of the population, convoked by the French regime, Mirabeau led the faction opposing Bailly and Lafayette. Samuel Romilly in England and Abbé Morellet in France arranged that Bentham would compose and Dumont would translate the speeches that Mirabeau would recite. Etienne Clavière furnished Mirabeau's writings on finance. Mirabeau took a conference spectator, Desmoulins, into the writing of his propaganda publication. Desmoulins was paid and trained politically in this British covert operations endeavor. Camille Desmoulins became famous a few weeks after entering Mirabeau's employ. On July 11, 1789, the exasperated King Louis XVI again fired Finance Minister Jacques Necker. The next day, Desmoulins jumped up on a table at a cafe full of dissidents and told the crowd of Necker's dismissal. He warned them that a massacre of reformers was intended, took pistols out of his coat, shouted, "To arms," and led them out to the street riots. that spread throughout Paris. Some soon in the mob carried a wax bust of Necker. The rioters looted weapons from an armory and stormed the Bastille prison on July 14th, the first bloody act of the French Revolution. The king backed down and rehired Necker on July 16th. Necker was soon proposing an income tax as the supposed cure for national bankruptcy. It was enacted with the support of Mirabeau, who told the National Assembly that they must rush into action and show no mercy to those whom the taxation might ruin. A wry allusion to the British puppetry has made its way into Bartleby's commentary, accompanying their quotation of this speech. Quote, Dumont says, Mirabeau was not well acquainted with the subject of Necker's plan, and quotes the remark by the banker Pinchot that Mirabeau was, quote, the first man in the world to speak on a subject he knew nothing about, unquote. Necker's plan failed to relieve the treasury. In December 1790, Mirabeau was elected president of the populist Jacobin Club, which was becoming a sort of laboratory for the cultivation of violent extremism. Camille Desmoulins was one of its members at the time. May I say also, just as an aside, there's a book by a man called Edmond de Paris, about the Jesuits. It's called The True History of the Jesuits. And in that book, he describes how the Jacobins were, in fact, a Jesuit construct. The Jacobins were people that met in a certain, I don't know if it was a church or what, but because of the agitation supported by a hidden hand, and I do agree with Edmond de Paris that it probably is a Jesuit thing, we can associate the motives of the Jesuits with the motives of Lord Shelburne and the British, who are trying to destroy France, create the chaos so the phoenix can rise. So that's just my comment. You know most of the story already. Jean-Paul Marat, one of Shelburne's Genevans, was then also the leader of the Cordelier Club, along with Danton and Desmoulins. Marat, under threat of arrest for his attack on the French regime, had been forced to return to London for a time the previous year. On July 16, 1791, Desmoulins led a crowd to the Paris city government petitioning for the overthrow of King Louis XVI. The next day, soldiers commanded by Lafayette fired on a crowd demonstrating for the Desmoulins petition. Warrants were issued for Danton and Desmoulins. Danton, eluding arrest, fled to England. On August 10, 1792, an armed mob led by Danton and Desmoulins attacked the Tuileries Palace and murdered the king's guards. The national regime fell apart. And in the new French revolutionary government, the National Convention, Danton was the justice minister. Desmoulins was his secretary general. Clavière, who is Shelburne's ghostwriter for Mirabeau, was made finance minister. Jean-Paul Marat now became famous by leading the September massacres, inciting National Guardsmen and others to murder over 1,000 jail prisoners, including priests, political dissidents, and aristocrats. Marat went on to promote the wholesale murder of the, quote, enemies of the people, unquote, as a revolutionary principle. The British hand in these events did not create the French Revolution, but helped to drive it over a cliff. Along the way, those who had aided the American Revolution and who sought to uplift mankind, Franklin's friends, in other words, were swept aside. The Paris astronomer mayor Jean-Sylvain Bailly and chemist Antoine Lavoisier were beheaded. General Lafayette fled arrest and was imprisoned abroad. Beaumarchais was exiled. Jean-Louis Giraud Soulavier, one of Franklin's scientific collaborators, exposed the British role in a historical account published a decade after the king's execution. Soulavier described in detail the role of exiles from Geneva, covert agents whom Britain paid to destroy the French government without Britain itself being blamed. Now to page 111, Shelburne as Jefferson's schoolmaster. Decades later, when describing the treasonous intrigues of pro-British Americans associated with the Hartford Convention, Thomas Jefferson wrote about the French Revolution in the same vein as had Soulavier. Now quoting Jefferson, "The foreigner gained time to anarchize by gold the government he could not overthrow by arms, to crush in their own councils the genuine Republicans by the fraternal embraces of exaggerated and hired pretenders, and to turn the machine of Jacobinism from the change to the destruction of order. The British ministers are playing the same game for disorganization here in the United States, which they played in France. The Marats, the Dantons, and Robespierre of Massachusetts are in the same pay, under the same orders, and making the same efforts to anarchize us as their prototypes in France were." Well, let me take a moment to say that's a very important statement, and think about how that idea of British efforts to anarchize us also describes what I think a large number of people believe is going on right now. As I commented in my Twitter post this morning, I do advance the notion, show me I'm wrong, that it is the Five Eyes. It is the combined intelligence agencies that are so powerful now that want to dissolve the United States, to break us down into regional parts, perhaps dominated by a city-state such as Chicago, such as Rahm Emanuel might be the Doge of Chicago, the grand city-state scheme of Geneva, created out of the chaos of anarchizing the existing government. Is that not what's going on right now? Back to the text, but his retrospective analysis does not mention Jefferson's own relationship to Shelburne and Company, the covert British fist in France. Jefferson had been introduced to François Duvernois, a manager of Shelburne's Swiss agents in 1785, had worked on his book with Morellet for 2 years, and had been in close contact with Shelburne's son, Lord Wycombe, early in 1788. In June 1788, Lord Shelburne's private secretary introduced Jefferson to Dugald Stewart, then in an early stage of his career as an advisor and confidant to the central figures in the British imperial oligarchy and British intelligence. Jefferson began an intensive conference with Stewart that continued through the summer of 1788. As Jefferson wrote in his old age, quote, "I became immediately intimate with Stewart, calling mutually on each other and almost daily during his stay in Paris, which was of some months. Stewart is a great man and among the most honest living." These daily conferences with the leading British teacher of imperial economics were preparing Jefferson to go back home and fight against the founders' program for American industrialization. As these Jefferson-Stewart sessions began in June 1788, delegates in Jefferson's state of Virginia were meeting to ratify the U.S. Constitution. By the end of that summer, Jacques Necker had returned to power, and Shelburne's Genevan team began setting up operations in France. Dugald Stewart was back in Paris during the fateful next summer of 1789. He and Jefferson left France at about the same time. Not long after the storming of the Bastille began the ruin of the French-American alliance. And there's another thought that I never thought of before, was that the French-American alliance was with the remnants of the nobility and not with the Robespierre and Danton crowd. So the destruction of the French nobility also destroys the French-American alliance, which is certainly in Britain's interest. Jefferson was elated at the actions of the French street mobs and denigrated the widespread belief that the British were organizing the insurrection to destroy France. Quote, "I do not believe that so great a fermentation ever produced so little injury in any other place. I have been through it daily, have observed the mobs with my own eyes in order to be satisfied of their objects, and declare to you that I saw so plainly the legitimacy of them, that I have slept in my house as quietly through the whole as I ever did in the most peaceable moments. I will agree to be stoned as a false prophet if all does not end well in this country. It is rumored and believed in Paris that the English have fomented with money the tumults of this place, and that they are arming to attack France. I have never seen any reason to believe either of these rumors." Well, that is the end of chapter 5, and we are now at chapter 6, called The New Economic System, Breaking from a Degraded World Order. The Revolutionary War had left the new nation heavily indebted, with continental and local currencies nearly worthless. Unpaid soldiers and bankrupt farmers were susceptible to manipulation by mob leaders. There was no modern industry, confined to the Atlantic coast with no east-west roads and only primitive ones running north-south. The U.S. economy continued to be based on the British colonial system. American raw materials, produce from southern slave plantations and northern farms, forests and fisheries, as well as raw iron, were traded for British manufactures, clothing, furniture, tools, and weapons. The British royalty, nobility, and financiers derived their fortunes from the slave trade, from the underclasses in India and Ireland, from slaves in the Caribbean and the American South, from wage cutting in British factories, and from financial speculations on world trade unbalanced in London's favor. America's southern planters and northern importers were tied commercially to this criminal empire, and they aped the, quote, sophisticated manners of the British elites. But the American nationalists had forged a constitutional frame of government that would enable the USA to break with this degraded world system and to improve men's lives with science and invention. President George Washington appointed Alexander Hamilton as Treasury Secretary, tasked with planning a financial rescue and a prosperous future. It is useful to view Hamilton from a certain special perspective based on his personal background, as someone who, from the time of his first youthful consciousness of the larger world, was an activist who thereafter immigrated into an American republic in the tumultuous process of being created. Pardon me just a moment. Well, it seems that the chat room is active as usual, and I pick up a little tidbit of knowledge. The margarita pizza was named after the benevolent Queen Margarita, the friend of my great grandparents. HSBC rewrote history, lied. Oops, it just lied that the king was pleased at putting down starved citizens. Lied. Well, I enjoy a margarita pizza when I am in Italy, and I haven't been there since what, 2010, I think. It's just far too long. What a difference it is to have pizza in Italy. It's different. We'll just leave it there. Anyway, always nice to see you guys chatting it up over there. So I have not read this chapter 6 yet. As I said, I was going to stick to treason in America, and when I had the great pleasure of meeting Anton Chaikin through our good friend uh, Chris Fogarty, the his preference, and of course it being much more contemporary, is that I read this book. And I did not know we were going to read so much about Alexander Hamilton. I was thinking, well, let's let that be, because of so many people have written about Alexander Hamilton. But with this controversy, I think, arisen by Truthstream Media's publication yesterday. And folks, if you don't know Aaron and Melissa Dykes' Truthstream Media, they do wonderful, uh, almost cinematic quality videos. And some of them are uh, more thought pieces, and some of them are real history. And this one was about the musical Hamilton. Really worthwhile to learn from Aaron and all of the history of the creation of that musical. It's a complete Rockefeller project from start, from the first thought to now. The Rockefellers are building up Alexander Hamilton as some kind of a great guy, and they use this musical to do it. And the question is why? Why do they want Alexander Hamilton to be a heroic figure? Well, it's because they're rewriting who he was. They told a lie. They made up a new narrative, and they sold it with song and dance. But nevertheless, I think that Truthstream Media went way overboard in just sliming Alexander Hamilton, the historical person, as nothing but a shadow banker, an agent, a secret agent of the old European banking system. And I think that from my point of view, it's important that we straighten this out. So I'm glad to be reading on in chapter 6 here today about Alexander Hamilton, Hamilton's unique path to the American Revolution. I'm on page 120. Alexander Hamilton was born in the British West Indies. When he was a teenager, he was taken under the wing of the Reverend Hugh Knox. This deeply philosophical Presbyterian minister had attended Princeton University, where he had been particularly close to the family of Elias Boudinot III, a member of Franklin's inner circle from Philadelphia. Reverend Knox went to the West Indies in 1755. He wrote a blistering pamphlet, parentheses, a letter to the Reverend Mr. Jacob Green of New Jersey, pointing out some difficulties in the Calvinistic scheme of divinity, close parentheses. In 1770, defending free will and attacking the radical fundamentalist theologian Jonathan Edwards. Knox knew Edwards somewhat from the inside, having studied theology at Princeton under Edwards' son-in-law, Aaron Burr Sr., the father of the future vice president. Knox supplied Hamilton with his first serious books, including classical literature, and inspired him to Christianity, opposition to slavery, and an awareness of the evil of the British Empire. Hamilton's biographers tell us that in August 1772, after a great hurricane, the clergyman preached a thundering sermon, warning of God's wrath against the wicked. A week later, young Alexander wrote an identical polemic, warning that to avoid God's vengeance, the rich must, quote, succor the miserable and lay up a treasure in heaven, unquote. And those who revel in affluence must, quote, seek the afflictions of humanity and bestow your superfluity to ease them. Knox's publication of Hamilton's piece led to the boy being sponsored by Knox's friends, Hamilton's cousin Anne Lytton Vinton, and Hamilton's employers to travel to the American mainland. With a letter of introduction from Knox, Hamilton went to live with Elias Boudinot IV, the son of Franklin's collaborator, in Elizabethtown, New Jersey. Hamilton was prepared for college in the patriotic Boudinot household, and after a year, he went to New York to attend King's College, later Columbia University. The outbreak of the shooting war with the British found him fully ready to play a man's part in the military struggle. Hamilton served during the Revolution as General Washington's aide-de-camp and de facto chief of staff. Within the Continental Congress, which was often slow to function effectively in support of the army, Elias Boudinot IV was the delegate politically closest to Washington and Hamilton, helping them to coordinate intelligence matters and prisoner exchanges. After the adoption of the Constitution in 1788, in the first session of the U.S. Congress, 1789, Representative Boudinot proposed that the functions of the Treasury be supervised by one man. He tailored the office to suit Hamilton, who was then chosen for the job by President George Washington after Robert Morris turned it down. As Treasury Secretary, Hamilton proposed that the government create a strong national currency, provide ample credit, and guide investment into machine-based industry and effective transportation, creating modern conditions of life. Growing economic power would ensure real independence and sovereignty to the new republic. The elected government, not the transatlantic oligarchy, would make strategic decisions. The Hamilton program, fully implemented, would doom the slave-based economy. Investment in more profitable, skilled industry would drain investment from plantations. Better paying jobs would make the competition from unpaid slave labor increasingly less popular and slavery abolition more likely. This modernization program would attract emulation by the nationalists overseas so that the entire European imperial system was threatened. London and, quote, Southern interests, unquote, were impelled into political war to arrest the Republic's founding program. The American mission of progress, embodied in Hamilton's proposals, and the fight over implementing that program formed the essential core of world history ever since. All later economic progress has proceeded from that revolutionary policy outlook. The fundamental contest of the two sides, progressive nationalism versus finance-based imperial interests, has continued up to the present. The sequence of events behind the fight. We shall outline here the showdown over America's founding economic policy that occurred during Washington's presidency. Understanding what happened requires attention to the actual sequence of events relevant to the Hamilton program. The public is usually served opinions about Hamilton and his proposals without any presentation of the relevant history of Hamilton himself, or of his two principal opponents, Jefferson and Madison, and under what circumstances they changed their approach to public affairs. We've already been following Jefferson's path toward the 1790s clash. In this chapter, we will bring in Jefferson's intersection with Madison, just prior to Madison's public turn against Hamilton. Hamilton and his allies had for many years been jointly shaping elements of the policies he would present as Treasury Secretary. This shared approach to national affairs is evident in an urgent memorial presented to President Washington and to Congress in late August 1789 by Pennsylvania holders of Revolutionary War bonds. They called for action to fulfill the national debt obligations in a way that would develop the country rather than impoverish it. The memorial reflected precisely the point of view of Hamilton, Robert Morris, and their nationalist Philadelphia collaborators, who had struggled as partners with Franklin and Washington to sustain the country financially through and after the Revolutionary War. In effect, this memorial could be seen as a pre-announcement by the Franklin-Hamilton Circle of what Hamilton would do about the debt crisis after he took office. The country faced disaster and ruin from its Revolutionary War debts in a seemingly impossible dilemma. The debts could not be paid off because the only way to raise enough revenue for that purpose would be to tax the impoverished people beyond their means, and that would push them to revolt, as in the recent Shays Rebellion. But the debts must be serviced, or the country would have no credit and would soon break apart in chaotic weakness. The Pennsylvania Memorial pointed the way out. Rather than being immediately paid off, the debt should be, quote, funded, unquote, with a permanent appropriation that could not lawfully be used for any other purpose than to pay interest when due, helping to stabilize the market price of the bonds. When confidence in these bonds had thus been established, people could buy and sell them at face value and could use them to purchase goods and services. In this way, the debt certificates would circulate as a new species of money. This would expand available cash and promote, quote, agriculture, commerce, and mechanics, that is, manufacturing or the machine industry. Creditors, even former opponents of the Revolution, would thus be connected to the prosperity of the Union as federal bondholders. This credit system would stimulate, quote, domestic industry and attract foreign capital to the aid of American enterprises. The Senate confirmed Hamilton as Treasury Secretary on September 11th, 1789. I don't know if there's any significance to September 11th, 1789, but I am more and more interested in the Kabbalah when you think about all the dates associated with my dad's life. Who knows? Were the Franklin and Jefferson people into the Kabbalah? 10 days later, Congress, having reviewed the Pennsylvania creditors' memorial, commissioned Hamilton to inquire into national and state indebtedness and to prepare a plan to support the country's public credit, to be reported to Congress at its session beginning in January. Jefferson and Madison on the Slave Hill. While Hamilton was at work on his monumental report, Thomas Jefferson returned from France in late November 1789, aiming to wage war against the nationalist consensus. He arrived just before Christmas at his plantation, Monticello. James Madison visited there a few days later. Though Madison had been Jefferson's close friend for 20 years, Madison had ably sustained Washington and Hamilton in the fight for the U.S. Constitution. Jefferson, on the contrary, had sent copies of his Notes on Virginia from Paris and London into the United States in an attempt to prevent the establishment of a strong central government for the Union. There, on his Virginia Hill, with hundreds of slaves, surrounded by Randolph cousins and other ruling gentry, Jefferson worked on Madison during a political strategy conference over several days. Madison, as a member of Congress, was recruited into Jefferson's projected political war. We may see what Jefferson was pressing Madison to do from a document that survives from that period. Jefferson showed Madison a letter he had begun drafting in France. In the letter, Jefferson assails the concept of funding the national debt as an enslavement of future citizens. Well, we're talking about that too, aren't we? We're selling our grandchildren's future by borrowing and borrowing and borrowing the national debt. Well, that's the argument. Same argument. And, it's a matter of circumstances and perspective, is it not? I mean, having some national debt is one thing, but having a national debt that is many, many, many times more than the wealth of the individuals of the country combined, that's insane. And that's where we're at right now. Insanity. Anyway, so says Jefferson, no generation can contract debts greater than may be paid during the course of its own existence. That's a nice idea. I like that. 19 years is the term beyond which neither the representatives of a nation nor even the whole nation itself assembled can validly extend a debt. Jefferson then attacks, quote, the received opinion that the public debts of one generation devolve on the next, unquote. In conclusion, he commissions Madison as his congressional avatar. And here's Jefferson talking to Madison. Turn this subject in your mind, my dear sir, and particularly as to the power of contracting debts, and develop it with that perspicuity and cogent logic so peculiarly yours. Your station in the councils of our country gives you an opportunity of reducing it to public consideration, of forcing it into discussion. It would further furnish matter for a fine preamble to our first law for appropriating the public revenue, and it will exclude at the threshold of our new government the contagious and ruinous errors of Europe, which have armed despots with means for binding in chains their fellow men, unquote. Despots binding in chains their fellow men. Crashing hypocrisy coming from that Virginian, owner of 600 slaves, who had abandoned his previous active opposition to African slavery. And that's an interesting place to stop. 127 is our page. I will scan ahead before the next one so that I can efficiently move us through the book. And I thank you for your attention this morning. Very interesting things going on in Ukraine, and I'm kind of a junkie of the sit-rep channels, so I'm going to go and find out what has happened, if anything, since the last time I checked. And thank you all so very much. This week I'm starting selected portions only from David Talbot's book, The Devil's Chessboard, the United States and Alan Dulles. And it is a blockbuster of a book. It's been on my shelf for about 4 years now. I've read a lot of it, but I went back to reread the whole thing recently, and I'm going to share at least 2 shows of that with you this week, the first one tomorrow at 11 a.m. So I will see you then. Everybody have a wonderful day.